You are, right now, somewhere between 200 and 400 trillion cells deep into being a person. And if you are pregnant, about half of you is currently operating under a temporary ceasefire. Your immune system has been quietly ordered to stand down around the one tissue in your entire body that is, genetically speaking, only half yours. That ceasefire is the reason you're alive today. Your mother's immune system could have treated you like an intruder. It didn't. It negotiated. Now, imagine something walks straight through that ceasefire wearing a fake badge. That's what we're doing today. Not because I want you afraid of your cat, I want you afraid of the right things for the right reasons with the right amount of information, which is historically not a service most of the internet provides on this subject. Most of what you've heard about toxoplasmosis and pregnancy is technically true, dramatically oversold, and missing the one detail that actually matters. So let's fix that. I'm a physician. I have spent an unreasonable number of years thinking about organisms that are smarter than they have any right to be, given that none of them have a brain. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand your own biology better than the most of the people currently telling you to give away your cat. Pregnancy is immunologically one of the strangest things your body ever agrees to do. A fetus is a foreign body by every normal biological definition. Half its genetic material comes from someone your immune system has never met. Under any other circumstance, your immune system would mount a full response against tissue that unfamiliar. Organ transplant recipients spend the rest of their lives on drugs specifically designed to prevent exactly that reaction. Pregnancy does it for free, on purpose, using an entirely different set of rules. The placenta isn't just a filter, it's more like a diplomatic embassy. It sits at the border between two immune systems and actively suppresses the kind of aggressive response that would otherwise treat the fetus as hostile tissue. Certain immune cells are told to stand down, certain signaling molecules are dialed back, the whole system shifts from attack anything unfamiliar to something closer to let's not start anything. This is a brilliant piece of evolutionary engineering. It is also, and I say this with the deepest respect for evolution's general competence, a security vulnerability. Because the moment you build a checkpoint that's designed to let certain things through without inspection, you have also built a door that something else can walk through if it happens to look like it belongs. Most of the time, nothing exploits that door. Most pregnancies proceed with the ceasefire intact and nothing takes advantage of it. But there is one organism that has spent millions of years getting extremely good at looking like it belongs anywhere it goes, and it doesn't care whether it's in a rodent, a bird, a cow, or the placenta of a woman who has never in her life thought about her cat's litter box as a medical device. That organism is Toxoplasma gondii, and here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. It isn't rare. It isn't exotic. Depending on the country, somewhere between roughly a third and half of the entire adult human population is currently walking around with this parasite quietly encysted somewhere in their body. Most of them with absolutely no idea, most of them completely fine. This is not a story about an obscure tropical disease. This is a story about something that is, right now, inside an enormous number of people reading this sentence. Here's where it gets genuinely elegant, in the way that only something trying to kill you can be elegant. Toxoplasma gondii has what parasitologists call a definitive host and an intermediate host, and the distinction matters enormously, so let's actually sit with it instead of rushing past it the way most explainers do. The definitive host is the cat, and specifically only members of the cat family. This is the one and only place on Earth where this parasite can complete its full sexual reproductive cycle. Inside a cat's intestinal lining, the parasite does something it can do nowhere else. It produces oocytes, a hardy, egg-like structure that gets shed in the cat's feces by the millions. A single infected cat can shed tens of millions of these oocytes over roughly 2 weeks, usually only once in its life, typically after its first exposure, often as a kitten.
Those oocytes are then released into soil, where, and this is the detail that should actually change how you think about this parasite, need 1 to 5 days outside the body to become infectious. Freshly shed cat feces are not immediately dangerous. This is not a jump scare pathogen. It needs to sit in soil, oxygenate, and mature before it becomes a threat, which is precisely why the actual medical advice around litter boxes is about frequency of cleaning, not about panic.
Once mature, those oocysts are shockingly durable. They can survive in soil or water for months, sometimes over a year, resistant to most disinfectants, freezing, and a wide range of environmental extremes. A gardener without gloves, a child in a sandbox, a farm animal grazing in a contaminated field, any of them can pick up an oocyst and become what's called an intermediate host. Intermediate hosts include essentially every warm-blooded animal on the planet: birds, rodents, livestock, and yes, humans. Inside an intermediate host, the parasite cannot complete its sexual cycle. It can't produce oocysts. Instead, it does something else. It converts into a fast-dividing form called a tachyzoite, breaks out of the gut, and goes looking for tissue to settle into, preferentially muscle, and this is the part we actually care about today, brain tissue. So there are really 2 doors into a human body. Door 1, eating or accidentally ingesting mature oocysts from contaminated soil, unwashed produce, or a litter box that hasn't been cleaned in a while. Door 2, and this one surprises almost everyone, eating undercooked meat from an animal that was itself an intermediate host carrying dormant tissue cysts. Lamb, pork, and venison are particular offenders. In many countries, contaminated meat is actually the more common route of transmission in adults, not the cat litter box everyone fixates on. Your cat is a real risk factor. Your undercooked steak has been quietly outperforming it this whole time. Let's go inside the actual invasion, because this is where the parasite stops being a statistic and starts being genuinely impressive. A tachyzoite doesn't get eaten by a cell the way you might imagine an infection working. It actively injects itself using a specialized structure at its tip that functions almost like a molecular syringe, forcing its way through the host cell's membrane under its own power. Once inside, it does something extraordinary. It builds its own private room. It's called a parasitophorous vacuole, essentially a custom-built membrane bubble that the parasite constructs from parts of the host cell's own membrane on the way in, engineering a compartment that the host cell's normal digestive and immune machinery largely fails to recognize as foreign. Think about what that actually means. Your cells have an internal quality control system whose entire job is tagging things that shouldn't be there and marking them for destruction. Toxoplasma gondii essentially checks in, remodels the room to disable the smoke detector, and settles in without triggering the alarm. It's not hiding from your immune system by being small. It's hiding by being a very good architect. Inside that vacuole, the tachyzoite divides rapidly, eventually rupturing the host cell and spreading to neighboring cells, repeating the process. This is the acute phase of infection, and in a healthy adult, it is, more often than not, almost completely silent. Maybe some mild flu-like symptoms, swollen lymph nodes, a bit of fatigue. Most people who have this infection have no idea it ever happened. Eventually, your immune system does catch up, inflammatory signaling ramps up, and the parasite responds by doing something remarkably calm under pressure. It converts from the fast-dividing tachyzoite into a slow, dormant form called a bradyzoite, and walls itself inside a thick-shelled tissue cyst, most commonly in muscle, the eye, and, the detail that matters most for today, the brain. That cyst can persist for the rest of your life. Your immune system knows it's there. It simply can't get through the wall. This is the chronic, latent phase of toxoplasmosis that a third to half of humanity is currently carrying around. And for the overwhelming majority of otherwise healthy people, it never causes a single symptom. Your immune system and this parasite have essentially negotiated a permanent truce. It stays quiet, contained, and dormant. You stay alive and mostly unbothered. Nobody involved is thrilled about the arrangement,
but it holds. There is exactly one scenario where that truce becomes catastrophic instead of stable, and this is the one we're actually here for. Before we go further, sit with this for a second. Toxoplasma gondii infects an estimated 1/3 of the entire human species. In many countries, seroprevalence, meaning the percentage of people whose blood shows evidence of past infection, climbs above 60%. This makes it, by some estimates, one of the most successful parasitic infections on the planet, arguably one of the most successful organisms on the planet, full stop, and most people carrying it have never once heard its name. It doesn't need to make you sick to succeed. From an evolutionary standpoint, quietly setting up permanent residence in 1/3 of humanity without killing most of its hosts is not a failure. That's spectacular success by any biological metric that matters.
You're pregnant. You've been pregnant for 11 weeks, and you feel, for the most part, unreasonably normal. Maybe a little tired, maybe you assume that's just what 11 weeks feels like because nobody hands you a baseline for comparison. 3 days ago, you gardened without gloves because the weather was nice, and the tomatoes weren't going to stake themselves. You also had a burger cooked a little pinker than usual at a barbecue because it was someone else's grill and you didn't want to make a fuss. Neither of those events felt like anything. There was no moment of alarm, no obvious signal, nothing you'd think to mention at your next appointment unless someone specifically asked. Inside you, though, a population of tachyzoites is currently dividing in your bloodstream, doing exactly what they're built to do, completely indifferent to the fact that you feel fine. Your innate immune system has already noticed and is already responding. You might feel a little more fatigued than usual, maybe some mild swelling in a lymph node you'd never think to check. Most people, pregnant or not, would call this nothing. Most of the time, biologically, it basically is nothing. This is the exact scenario where basically nothing and the one scenario we spent this whole video on happen to look identical from the outside, which is precisely why testing exists, rather than waiting for symptoms that for the overwhelming majority of adults never show up clearly enough to notice. Here's a detail that surprises almost everyone, including some of my own patients over the years. You don't need to own a cat, touch a cat, or even like cats to be exposed. Community and feral cat populations contaminate soil in parks, gardens, sandboxes, and farmland, regardless of who owns them. Studies looking at seroprevalence in vegetarians have still found meaningful infection rates, driven entirely by soil and produce contact rather than meat consumption. Your own indoor cat that's never eaten a raw diet and never hunted outdoors is, statistically, one of the lower risk sources of exposure in your daily life, which is exactly the opposite of what most of the internet implies when this topic comes up. True or false? If you're pregnant, you need to get rid of your cat. Verdict: false. And this is the myth that causes genuinely unnecessary heartbreak every single year, so let's be precise about it. Reality: the danger isn't your cat existing. The danger is a specific, narrow event, a pregnant person acquiring a brand new Toxoplasma infection for the first time during pregnancy. If you already had this parasite before you became pregnant, which, remember, is true for a huge portion of the adult population, your immune system already built its defenses years ago. Your antibodies are already standing guard. The dormant cysts you're carrying are not the threat. A first-time infection during pregnancy is the threat, because that's the only scenario where the parasite is actively multiplying, actively spreading through the bloodstream, at the exact moment your placenta's checkpoint is standing at ease. Indoor cats that don't hunt and aren't fed raw meat have an extremely low likelihood of carrying an active infection in the first place, because they typically only pick it up from eating infected prey or contaminated raw meat. The actual medical guidance has never been, give away your cat. It's always been, have someone else change the litter box during pregnancy, or wear gloves and wash your hands thoroughly, and clean it daily, since the oocytes need 1 to 5 days to become infectious anyway. Your cat is not a biohazard.
Your cat is a low-maintenance risk factor that is trivially easy to manage, and giving it away accomplishes approximately nothing for your actual risk while accomplishing a great deal of unnecessary grief. Here's what the actual data looks like, because vague fear is useless and specific numbers, properly explained, are not. Congenital toxoplasmosis, meaning transmission from a newly infected mother to her fetus, occurs in roughly 1 in every 1,000 to 10,000 live births in the United States, with rates varying significantly by country depending on local infection prevalence and food safety practices. In France, historically, rates have run notably higher due to a stronger cultural preference for less cooked meat, which is part of why French prenatal care has, for decades, included routine toxoplasmosis screening that most other countries don't perform. Here's the detail that should genuinely reframe how you think about the risk. Transmission likelihood and severity move in almost opposite directions depending on when during pregnancy the infection occurs. In the first trimester, the parasite is actually less likely to cross the placenta. The placental barrier is doing its best work early on. But if it does cross that early, the damage tends to be severe because the fetal brain and organs are still in their earliest, most vulnerable stages of formation. In the third trimester, the placenta has thinned and become more permeable as it prepares for delivery, so transmission is far more likely, sometimes occurring in the majority of untreated cases. But by that point, the fetus's organs are largely formed, so the resulting damage, when it occurs, tends to be milder or, in many cases, not apparent at birth at all.
That last part is worth sitting with because it's counterintuitive and clinically important. A baby can be born looking completely healthy after a third trimester infection and still develop symptoms, most commonly eye disease, specifically a condition called chorioretinitis, months or even years later. This is why some countries screen not just at birth, but for years afterward. When congenital toxoplasmosis does cause visible damage, it can include intracranial calcifications, small deposits of calcium visible on brain imaging where the parasite caused localized tissue damage, and the body's repair response left mineral deposits behind. Hydrocephalus, an abnormal buildup of fluid inside the brain's ventricles that can occur when the parasite disrupts normal cerebrospinal fluid drainage pathways, and in severe cases, microcephaly, seizures, and significant developmental delay. The classic triad taught in medical schools is chorioretinitis, intracranial calcifications, and hydrocephalus, though in reality, most congenitally infected infants show none of these obvious signs at birth and are only identified through screening or years later through vision problems or subtle developmental differences. Let's actually go inside the immune response, because this is where the story gets almost tragic in its logic. When Toxoplasma first enters a body, the innate immune system, the fast, non-specific first responders, notices something unfamiliar almost immediately. Specialized cells recognize certain molecular patterns on the parasite's surface and trigger an inflammatory alarm, calling in reinforcements and ramping up a signaling molecule called interferon gamma, which is essentially the immune system's version of shouting all hands on deck to every nearby cell. This response is remarkably effective at controlling the infection in an otherwise healthy adult. Interferon gamma triggers infected cells to become hostile environments for the parasite, restricting nutrients, acidifying compartments, doing everything short of self-destruction to make the tachyzoid's life difficult. This is generally a fantastic system. It's the reason most people carrying this parasite never know it. But during pregnancy, remember the ceasefire we talked about at the start? That same aggressive interferon gamma response, if left fully active, would also threaten the pregnancy itself, because a lot of the immune signaling that fights off Toxoplasma effectively is the same kind of inflammatory signaling that, in excess, can damage placental tissue and threaten fetal viability. So the body is quite literally caught between two threats it's trying not to make worse. Fight the parasite too aggressively, and you risk the pregnancy through inflammation. Don't fight hard enough, and the parasite has an open door to cross into fetal tissue. There is no clean solution to this. The body does its best.
Sometimes the best is enough, sometimes it isn't. This is not a story about your immune system failing you. It's a story about your immune system trying to solve two competing problems with only one set of tools, in real time, without the luxury of stopping to think about it. Here's the actual narrow window where all of this becomes dangerous, and I want to be precise about it because precision is the entire point of this video. The exception is a primary, meaning first-ever Toxoplasma infection occurring during pregnancy in someone who had no prior exposure and therefore zero existing immunity, which puts them in the one category actually at meaningful risk. If you test seronegative, you get specific guidance about meat handling, gardening, and litter boxes for the rest of the pregnancy, sometimes with repeat testing every trimester to catch a new infection early. If you test seropositive from before pregnancy, in the overwhelming majority of cases, you and your fetus are not at meaningful risk from this parasite at all.
There's a second exception worth mentioning briefly because it illustrates the same principle from a different angle. Severely immunocompromised patients, someone with advanced HIV or a transplant recipient on immunosuppressive drugs, can experience a dormant, years-old Toxoplasma infection reactivate because the immune wall holding those bradyzoite cysts in check depends entirely on ongoing immune surveillance. Take away the surveillance, and old business can reopen. In these patients, reactivated toxoplasmosis can cause serious brain inflammation called toxoplasmic encephalitis, which was, before modern antiretroviral therapy, one of the more common opportunistic brain infections seen in advanced AIDS. Same parasite, same dormant cysts that a third of humanity is carrying. The danger was never really about the parasite changing. It's about the immune system's ability to keep watching. Here is the part of this story that genuinely frustrates physicians because the treatment itself involves choosing which risk to accept. If a pregnant patient is diagnosed with a new Toxoplasma infection, the standard early treatment is a drug called spiromycin. Here's the strange part. Spiromycin doesn't cross the placenta particularly well. That's not a flaw, it's the entire point of using it first. It concentrates in placental tissue and helps reduce the likelihood that the parasite crosses from mother to fetus in the first place, essentially reinforcing the checkpoint from the outside without exposing the fetus directly to the drug. But if testing confirms the fetus has already been infected, usually through amniotic fluid testing, treatment typically shifts to a combination of pyrimethamine and sulfadiazine, which do cross the placenta and can directly treat an infected fetus. Here's the paradox. Pyrimethamine works by blocking folate metabolism, which the parasite needs to divide, but folate metabolism is also essential for normal fetal development, particularly neural tissue. So physicians have to walk an extremely narrow line, adding folinic acid supplementation to protect the fetus from the drug's side effects while still blocking the parasite's ability to use the same pathway. You are, quite literally, trying to starve the parasite of something your fetus also needs, using a drug precise enough to hurt one and spare the other, in a system where both patients share a blood supply. This is medicine at its most honest. There often isn't a clean, harmless option. There's a decision about which risk is more survivable, made with incomplete information, updated as new information, an ultrasound and amniotic test result comes in. Anyone who tells you medicine is simply following the science has never actually had to choose between two imperfect treatments in a room with a frightened patient. Now, before we close, I have to tell you the part of this story that made me fall in love with parasitology in the first place, because it's genuinely one of the strangest findings in modern biology, and it explains something you've probably wondered about without realizing it connects here. Toxoplasma gondii can only complete its full reproductive cycle inside a cat, which means, from a purely evolutionary standpoint, the parasite has a very specific problem to solve. How do you get from a rodent's brain back into a cat's stomach? Multiple animal studies, largely in rodents, have found that Toxoplasma infection appears to alter host behavior in ways that plausibly increase the odds of exactly that transition. Infected rodents in laboratory studies have shown reduced innate aversion to cat odor, in some studies actually showing something closer to mild attraction to the smell of cat urine, a smell that uninfected rodents instinctively avoid their entire lives.
Some researchers have proposed this involves the parasite altering activity in brain regions associated with fear processing and, intriguingly, regions associated with sexual attraction, essentially, in one hypothesis, hijacking an existing neural circuit rather than building a new one from scratch. I want to be careful here because this is exactly the kind of finding that gets wildly oversold online. The precise mechanism is still an active area of research, and results have varied somewhat between different research groups and rodent models. What's fairly well supported is the behavioral outcome. What's still genuinely debated is the exact neurological why.
Here's where I have to slow down and be honest with you about the human side of this, because this is where headlines love to run further than the evidence actually goes. There have been observational studies looking at correlations between Toxoplasma seropositivity in humans and various behavioral and psychiatric measures, including some studies suggesting associations with slower reaction times, increased risk-taking behavior, and even a possible association with schizophrenia risk. I want to be extremely precise about the category these findings fall into. These are correlational studies, not proof of causation, and the human brain and human behavior are influenced by an enormous number of confounding factors that are very difficult to fully control for in this kind of research. Some studies have found associations. Others have failed to replicate them. This entire area remains, scientifically speaking, in the hypothesis category, not the established mechanism category, and I'd be doing you a disservice if I dressed it up as more settled than it is. What we can say with actual confidence is that this parasite demonstrably alters behavior in some other mammals in ways that plausibly benefit its own life cycle. Whether it meaningfully alters human personality is a genuinely open, actively studied question, and open question is a very different sentence than your cat is controlling your mind, no matter how much better the second sentence performs online. True or false? Cooking meat well done is the only way to be safe, so anyone who enjoys a medium rare steak is playing roulette with a parasite. Verdict: partly true, meaningfully overstated. Reality: tissue cysts are killed at temperatures well below the point most people consider well done. The USDA recommends an internal temperature of about 145 degrees Fahrenheit for whole cuts of pork, beef, veal, and lamb, followed by a short rest time, a temperature most people would still comfortably call medium, not the shoe leather standard that well done implies. Freezing meat at typical home freezer temperatures for several days also substantially reduces, though doesn't perfectly guarantee, viability of any tissue cysts present, since extended freezing damages the cyst wall in a way brief refrigeration doesn't. The actual rule isn't cook everything to charcoal, it's hit a specific moderate internal temperature, which is a much smaller ask than the myth implies, and one a meat thermometer solves in about 4 seconds. So here's what I actually want you to walk away with, because fear without a plan is useless, and a plan is very easy to build here. If you are pregnant or planning to become pregnant, the single most useful thing you can do is know your antibody status before it matters. Ask your provider about toxoplasmosis screening, especially if you've never been tested. If you're already seropositive, you can relax about this particular parasite for the rest of your pregnancy. The dormant infection you're carrying is not the threat. If you're seronegative, the actual precautions are small and manageable, not dramatic. Cook meat to a safe internal temperature. This eliminates tissue cysts entirely, and it's a bigger protective factor for most adults than the litter box conversation everyone fixates on. Wash produce, especially anything that grows in or touches soil. Wear gloves when gardening, and wash your hands afterward. If you have a cat, have someone else handle the litter box for the duration of the pregnancy if at all possible. And if that's not an option, wear gloves, wash your hands thoroughly, and clean the box daily. Remember, those oocysts need 1 to 5 days outside the body to become infectious, so daily cleaning genuinely matters and genuinely helps. You do not need to remove your cat from your home. That advice causes real grief for a marginal, easily managed risk. And I want to say that plainly because too many people have been told otherwise by well-meaning but imprecise sources. If congenital infection is diagnosed, know that outcomes vary enormously depending on timing and treatment, and that early treatment meaningfully improves outcomes, which is exactly why screening programs exist in the first place. This isn't a story with one ending, it's a story with a wide range of possible endings, and the single biggest factor in which one you get is how early the situation is identified.
And if you take nothing else from today, take this. The reason medicine feels frightening from the outside is usually that nobody explained the actual rules governing the situation, just the worst-case outcome stripped of context designed to make you scroll further. Once you understand that this parasite's danger depends almost entirely on timing, prior immunity, and a fairly narrow set of circumstances, it stops being an abstract horror and becomes something you can actually manage because you understand exactly what you're managing. That, more than any individual fact today, is the whole point of what I do. Biology isn't trying to frighten you, it's just running on rules nobody bothered to hand you at any point in your life. Once you have the rules, most of the fear turns out to have been standing in for information you simply didn't have yet. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.